Confessions of a Convert by Robert Hugh Benson. Preface. The following chapters were first published in substance in the American Catholic magazine, the Ave Maria, in 1906 to 1907, and it is by the kind permission of the editor, Father Hudson, that they are now reprinted with a few additions and corrections. During the time that has elapsed since their serial appearance, the writer has received a very large number of applications that they should be issued in book form, and after long hesitation he has acceded to these requests. He hesitated partly because it appeared to him really doubtful whether their issue would be of any real service at all, partly because he occasionally contemplated adding considerably to them, and annexing to them further confessions of a convert since his conversion. This latter idea, however, he has abandoned for the present, owing to the extraordinary difficulty he has found in drawing any real comparisons between the rapidly fading impression of Anglicanism upon his memory and the continually deepening experiences of the Catholic religion. Cardinal Newman compares somewhere the sensations of a convert from Anglicanism to those of a man in a fairy story, who, after wandering all night in a city of enchantment, turns after sunrise to look back upon it and finds to his astonishment that the buildings are no longer there. They have gone up like wraiths and mists under the light of the risen day. So the present writer has found. He no longer, as in the first months of his conversion, is capable of comparing the two systems of belief together, since that which he has left appears to him no longer a coherent system at all. There are, of course, associations, memories, and emotions still left in his mind, some of them very sacred and dear to his heart. He still is happy in numbering among his friends many persons who still find amongst those associations and memories a system which they believe to be the religion instituted by Jesus Christ. Yet he himself can no longer see in them anything more than hints and fragments and aspirations, detached from their center and reconstructed into a purely human edifice without foundation or solidity. Yet he is conscious of no bitterness at all. At the worst he experiences sometimes a touch of impatience, merely at the thought of having been delayed so long by shadows from the possession of divine substance. He cannot, however, with justice, compare the two systems at all. One cannot adequately compare a dream with a reality. He has abandoned, therefore, the attempt, which lack of leisure in any case would make practically useless, to place side by side with his drowsy memories of Anglicanism the story of his vivid adventures under the sunlight of eternal truth. And he publishes the history of that long-drawn process whereby he passed from the one to the other, purely on the advice of numerous friends and inquirers. He is conscious of the appalling egotism of such pages as these, yet he still has to learn how an autobiography can be written without it.
Chapter 1. When one stands at last upon high ground, it is extraordinarily difficult to trace the road behind by which one has approached. It winds, rises, falls, broadens and narrows, until the mind is bewildered. Nor indeed do the comments of friends and critics shouted from below tend to clear the situation. I have been told that I became a Catholic because I was dispirited at failure, and because I was elated at success, because I was imaginative, and because I was unperceptive, because I was not hopeful enough, and because I was too hopeful, faithless and too trusting, too ardent and too despairing, proud and pusillanimous. I have even been told, since the first publication of these papers, that I have never truly understood the Church of England. Of course that is possible, but if so, it is certainly not for lack of opportunity. I was brought up, as will be seen presently, in an ecclesiastical household for 25 years. I was a clergyman for 9 years, in town and country, and a religious house. My father was the spiritual head of the Anglican communion. My mother, brothers, and sisters are still members of it, as well as a large number of my friends. I was prepared for orders by the most eminent evangelical of his day. I ended by becoming a convinced High Churchman. It seems further, now that I have my pen in my hand, that I never before really attempted to disentangle the strands, and that it is rash of me to attempt it now. It is full of danger. It is extremely easy to deceive oneself, and it is extremely hard not to be self-conscious and complacent, not to see only what one would wish to see, and above everything, one is afraid that, after all, it is bound to be very unconvincing to other people. For you cannot trace the guidance of the Spirit of God, or diagnose his operations in the secret rooms of the soul. He seems at times to let good go and to bring instead good out of evil, and light into voluntary darkness. At the best, therefore, all that is possible is to describe the external features of the country through which the soul has passed, the cross-roads, the obstacles, the ravines, and to give some sort of account of the consultations held by the way. Faith, after all, is a divine operation wrought in the dark, even though it may seem to be embodied in the intellectual arguments and historical facts. For it is necessary to remember that two equally sincere and intelligent souls may encounter the same external evidences and draw mutually exclusive conclusions from them. The real heart of the matter lies somewhere else. Catechumens, therefore, must remember that while on the one side they must of course clear the ground by the action of the intellect, on the other side it is far more vital that they should pray, purify motives, and yield themselves to God. First, I think it will be as well to describe, as far as is possible, my original religious education and position. I was brought up in the moderate high church school of thought, and naturally accepted that position as the one most truly representative of the Anglican community. I learned, that is to say, so far as I could understand them, the tenets of the Caroline divines. I was taught to be reverent, sober-minded, anti-Roman, to believe in the real presence without defining it, to appreciate stateliness, dignity, and beauty in worship, to study first the Bible in general and later the Greek Testament. It seems to me, if I may say it without impertinence, that my religious education was excellently wise. I was interested in religion. I worshipped in dignified cathedrals and churches. I was allowed to go out before the sermon. I was told the stories of Dr. Neale and the allegories of Dr. Wilberforce and the histories of the early Christian martyrs, and the virtues held up to me as the most admirable were those of truthfulness, courage, honor, obedience, and reverence. I do not think that I loved God consciously, but at least I was never frightened at the presentation of him, or terrified by the threat of hell. I think I accepted him, quite unemotionally, as universal parental presence and authority. The person of our Lord I apprehended more from the Gospels than from spiritual experience. I thought of him in the past and the future tenses, seldom in the present. My father's influence upon me was always so great that I despair of describing it. I do not think that he understood me very well, but his personality was so dominant and insistent that the lack of this understanding made very little difference. He formed and moulded my views on religious matters in such a manner that it would have seemed to me, while he lived, a kind of blasphemy to have held other opinions than his. Certain points in his system of belief puzzled me then, and they puzzle me still. Yet these no more produced in my mind any serious question as to the soundness and truth of his faith than intellectual difficulties in God's revelation produce doubts in my mind at the present time. He was in the main a high churchman of the old school. He had an intense love of dignity and splendor in divine worship, a great sense of church authority, and a firm orthodoxy with regard to the main foundations of the Christian creed. Yet while he would say, partly humorously, yet with a great deal of seriousness too, that he ought really to have been a canon in a French cathedral, while he would recite scrupulously every day the morning and evening prayer of the Church of England, while he had an intense love of church history and a deep knowledge both of that and of Christian liturgies and the writings of the Fathers, yet in quite unexpected points he would fail, as it seemed to me, in carrying out his principles. For example, there is no custom more deeply rooted in antiquity, or more explicitly enjoined in the Book of Common Prayer, than that of the Friday fast. There is scarcely any ecclesiastical discipline more primitive than that which forbids the marriage of a man who has already received major orders. There is nothing more clear, I should have thought, among the disputed questions of matrimony, than that the release of one partner, with leave to marry again, simultaneously releases the other partner from the bond. Yet I am still wholly unable to understand, remembering his enthusiastic love of what I may call church principles, how my father justified, as I am convinced he did justify, his attitude to these 3 points, for I never remember him abstaining from meat on a Friday or any other day, though I know that he denied himself instead in other ways. He raised no objection, except on purely private grounds, to Anglican clergy or bishops contracting marriage, and he held, I know, that while the guilty party, when a divorce had been pronounced by the law of the land, must not seek the blessing of the Church upon a subsequent union, the innocent party was perfectly at liberty to do so. Again, I never understood, and do not understand now, how my father interpreted the words, "I believe in the Holy Catholic Church." He would rule out, I know, from external unity those bodies of Christians that do not even claim to possess episcopal succession. He hesitated, as I shall relate presently, as to whether or no the Church of Rome had forfeited, through her profession of what he believed to be heretical doctrines, her place in the body of Christ. Yet he showed the greatest sympathy with and care for certain groups of Eastern Christians, whose tenets have been explicitly condemned by councils which he himself would acknowledge as ecumenical. Again, I have never really understood his attitude towards such doctrines as those of the sacrament of penance. He held firmly in theory that Jesus Christ had given authority to his ministers to declare and pronounce to his people, being penitent, the absolution and remission of their sins. And as a matter of practice, he himself, at a certain crisis in my life, recommended to me, when I told him that I wished to go to confession, a discreet and learned clergyman to whom I had better apply. Yet he never urged the practice, so far as I am aware, upon anyone, and never went to confession himself. He believed then in the power of the keys. Yet he seemed to hold simultaneously that this relief was to be sought only if peace of mind could not be obtained by other means, unless indeed he held, as I think possible, that the power was effectively exercised in the public absolutions uttered in the course of the church services. He appears, therefore, on the surface, to have held that the authority given with such extraordinary solemnity by Christ to his apostles was not in the least even normally necessary to the forgiveness of post-baptismal mortal sin. Now, I am perfectly convinced that my father did not believe himself inconsistent, that he had, in fact, principles which reconciled to his own mind these apparent contradictions. Yet I never knew, and do not now know, what they were. For though he loved nothing better than to be consulted by his children on religious matters, as a matter of fact he was not very approachable by timid minds. I used always to be a little afraid of showing ignorance, and still more of shocking him. Never once in a genuine difficulty did I find him anything but utterly tender and considerate. Yet his intense personality and his almost fierce faith continually produced in me the illusion that he would think it unfilial of me to do anything except acquiesce instantly in his judgment. The result was that I was often completely at a loss as to what that judgment was. Religion at home, then, was always coloured and vivified by my father's individuality. I remember even now the sense of finality and completeness which it conveyed. The morning and evening services, first in the tiny prayer room at Lincoln, where my father was chancellor from my first to my 5th year, then in the beautiful minute chapel at l'Escope, Truro, where he was bishop until after my 13th birthday, and finally in the lovely chapels at Lambeth and Addington, after his elevation to the see of Canterbury. These services, every detail of which was thought out by my father and carried out liturgically and reverently, still have a strange aroma to my mind that I suppose my memory will never lose. Other ways in which my father influenced my religion were as follows. On Sunday afternoons in the country we would walk with him, rather slowly and recollectedly, for about an hour and a half, and during these expeditions one of us would usually read aloud, or sometimes my father himself would read aloud from some religious book. I do not think that these books were very well selected for a boy's point of view. The poems of George Herbert were frequently read on these occasions, and these very peculiar, scholarly, and ingenious meditations used to produce in me, occasionally, a sudden thrill of pleasure, but far more commonly a kind of despairing impatience. Or again, some interminable life of a saint, or a volume of church history would be read, or a book of Dean Stanley's on the Holy Land. Only once can I remember, with real delight, so far back as early in the 80s, how my father fascinated me for half an hour or so by reading aloud, as we walked, the martyrdom of Saint Perpetua and her companions. I remember, too, the irrepressible awe with which I discovered presently that he had been translating aloud and at sight, in perfect English, and without hesitation, from the Latin Acta Martyrum. At the close of these Sunday walks, and sometimes also on weekdays after breakfast, we would go to my father's study for Bible reading or Greek Testament. It is difficult to describe these lessons. For the most part, my father would comment continuously and brilliantly, though often far above my capacity to understand, putting questions occasionally, showing great pleasure when we answered intelligently, or, still more, when we put reasonable questions of our own, and a rather oppressive disappointment when we were listless or stupid. It was all extremely stimulating to the intellect. It was also always somewhat of a strain, but I think now that its lack consisted in the predominance of the mind element over the soul. I do not remember that these lessons made it easier to love God. They were often interesting and sometimes absorbing, but I do not, with all reverence to my father's memory, even now believe that in myself they developed the spiritual side of religion. For himself, with his own great spirituality, it was natural enough that his soul should find pleasurable activity in the intellectual scholarly plane. For myself, there was a considerable tendency to think that intellectualism and Greek Testament ought to be the very heart of religion. For a child, I believe, there are other moulds more natural than that of the intellect, in which spiritual life may shape itself. Little pieces of ceremonial connected, for example, with the saying of his prayers, actions of reverence such as the sign of the cross or the fingering of beads, symbolic objects of worship such as crucifixes or statues, and for instruction, an almost endless use of attractive and well-drawn pictures. These, I believe, are a better machinery for the shaping and development of a child's spiritual life than the methods of the intellect. I remember, for instance, that while George Herbert's poems usually bored and irritated me, I found a real attraction in the quaint devices of Easter wings or the altar, the outlines, that is to say, in which once or twice he prints his verses on the page. As regards morality, I was also a little puzzled by my father's attitude. He had a very great sense of the duty of obedience, and this sense, I think, rather overpowering in its sternness, tended to obscure to some extent in my own mind the various grades of objective wrongdoing. 2 or 3 sins stood out to me in my childhood as supremely wicked, such things as lying, thieving, and cruelty. But beyond these, practically all other sins seemed to me about the same. To climb over the wire fences that bounded the drive at L'Escoupe, by putting one's feet anywhere except at the point where the wire pierced the upright railings. My father bade me always do this to avoid stretching the wire, seemed to me about as wicked as to lose my temper, to sulk, or to be guilty of meanness. In this way, to some degree, one's appreciation of morality was, I think, a little dulled, since to forget an order, or to disregard it in a moment of blinding excitement, was visited by my father with what appeared to be as much anger as if it had been a deliberate moral fault. Once, later, at Eton, I was accused of grave cruelty to another boy, and was very nearly flogged for it. I happened to be innocent, and ultimately cleared myself entirely of the charge after a very searching examination by the head master. But for the time, after the news of the charge had come to my father in the holidays while I was at home, I was very nearly paralyzed in mind by the appalling atmosphere of my father's indignation, and wholly failed to defend myself except by tears and silent despair. Yet all the time I was conscious of a faint relief in the knowledge that even if I were guilty, and at the time so confused was I that I really scarcely knew whether I was guilty or not, my father could not possibly be angrier with me than he had been, for instance, when I threw stones at the goldfish in the pond, or played with my fingers during prayers. Such more or less was my father's influence upon my religious life. I do not, as I have said, think that he made it easy to love God, but he did undoubtedly establish in my mind an ineradicable sense of a moral government in the universe, of a tremendous power behind phenomena, of an austere and orderly dignity with which this moral power presented itself. He himself was wonderfully tender-hearted and loving, intensely desirous of my good, and, if I had but known it, touchingly covetous of my love and confidence. Yet his very anxiety on my behalf, to some degree, obscured the fire of his love, or rather caused it to affect me as heat rather than as light. He dominated me completely by his own forcefulness, and I felt when he died, as a man said to me of his own parallel experience, as if the roof were lifted off the world. At my private school in Clevedon, we attended a church rather more high than those to which I had been accustomed. It contained a dark, mystical-looking sanctuary, with iron and brass gates. The clergy wore coloured stoles, and Gregorian chants were in use. But I have not the slightest recollection of being astonished at any difference of doctrine from that which I had learned, though I was, I think, a little awed and curious at the minute variations of ritual, and certainly depressed by the species of plain song we employed. At Eton, however, I found myself back again in the familiar academic atmosphere of plain dignity, beautiful singing, and indefiniteness of dogma. And it was here, I suppose, that I should have received deep impressions of religion. But I did not, nor did any other boy of my acquaintance, so far as I am aware. My confirmation was postponed a year or two, because I was supposed to be indifferent to it, as indeed I was. I regarded it as a seemly ceremony, to be undergone with gravity, and to represent a kind of spiritual coming of age, and I was really surprised when, upon at last inquiring of my father as to when I was to be confirmed, since most of my friends already were so, I was told that I ought to have been confirmed a year before, but that the rite had been postponed because I had not seemed to desire it. However, since I had taken the initiative at last, it should be as I suggested. I heard this with a faint sense of injustice, for I had become so accustomed to follow my father's lead in matters of religion, that it had never even occurred to me that in any matter I ought to take the initiative myself. But even confirmation, combined with very loving and impressive talks from my father, made no difference to me. For my preparation I went to my tutor, who talked to me about half a dozen times alone, chiefly on morality and the need of being strenuous. I cannot remember that much was said about doctrine. It was rather taken for granted. For example, a kind of informal confession was suggested to me tentatively, though no word was said of absolution. And indeed the idea of such a thing was completely unfamiliar to me. I answered that I had nothing I wished to reveal. Finally, Dr. Gulbrand's Personal Religion, a stout, unattractive book, was presented to me a year or two ago. I found it again, and noticed that the leaves were still uncut. So little impression, in fact, did the whole affair make on me, that I cannot remember even what bishop it was that performed the ceremony, though I think it must have been the famous historian Dr. Stubbs of Oxford. The only incident connected with my confirmation that is really clear to my mind is an anxious consultation held afterwards with 3 friends as to whether it would be decent to play fives in the afternoon, or whether it would be more proper to spend the time in decorous silence. We were not, I believe, in the least hypocritical or contemptuous. We wished to do what was right in the matter, and if fives could be reconciled with it, so much the better. We decided to play, and did so with a slightly chastened air. My mother also, soon after, gave me a little silver Maltese cross, engraved with the date of my confirmation, March 26th, 1887. I wore it on my watch chain for a while, for at Eton at that time there was as little opposition as enthusiasm towards religion, and presently lost it. On the day of communion I think I was rather more impressed. It was all unusual and mysterious, for only once before in my life had I ever attended the service. I vaguely believed that I entered into a closer relationship with my divine ruler than ever before, and although I was slightly depressed at the thought in the future I must behave myself better, I believed that I sincerely intended to do so. 2 other incidents I also remember connected with religion about this time. The first was my discovery in a deserted tower room at Lambeth of a copy of Dr. Ken's Prayers for Winchester Scholars, which somehow appealed to my imagination, and in which my father with great pleasure wrote my name when I asked him if I might have the book. I used this assiduously for a few months, liking, I think, the English and a certain gracious formality about the book. Then I dropped my prayers altogether, and only went to communion, though each time, I think, with tolerably good intentions, so often as it was necessary to avoid attention. The second incident was one entirely uncharacteristic of Eton. the son of an evangelical dignitary, underwent some sort of a religious crisis at home, and set to work with praiseworthy zeal upon his acquaintances. I was one of them, and was persuaded by him, with a friend of mine, to attend a Bible reading with prayer held in his room. About 4 other boys assembled, and we sat there in horror, exchanging furtive glances while our leader expounded. At the sound of a footstep outside, Bibles vanished as if in conjuring tricks, and exercises, I remember, were brought to an end, and after 2 meetings, by a sudden irrepressible explosion of laughter from my own particular friend. He sat there scarlet-faced, with the tears streaming down his cheeks, and laughter bursting from him in successive explosions, while the rest of us giggled and eyed our instructor alternately. I think that the whole affair would have been extremely unhealthy if it had affected us in the slightest. Fortunately it did not, and we came away with our opinion unchanged that such zeal was all rather bad form and of no value. Our evangelizer, however, was not discouraged, and his next attempt was more serious. He managed somehow to persuade an old boy to come down to Eton and address the house, which he did. I regret to say, in the presence of the house master. It was very terrible. He delivered an emotional speech that was practically an open confession of his own evil living at school. I do not think I have ever seen boys more sincerely horrified, not indeed at the substance of his story, but at the appalling bad form of alluding to it in a public manner. This same attitude towards morality manifested itself in other ways. Chapel services at Eton counted for very little indeed, usually in a religious direction. They were rather artistic, very academic, and represented, I think, the same kind of official homage to Almighty God as cheering the Queen when she came to see us, or when we, as on the occasion of her first Jubilee, went to the castle to see her, represented our loyalty towards Victoria. You might or might not be personally enthusiastic, but at least you must pay a seemly deference. Now and again, however, one clerical master in particular would make an honest attempt to appeal personally in a sermon to the consciences of his hearers, especially on the subject of purity. Now his hearers, in the main, had no common code on the matter at all. A boy might be fantastically evil in that regard, or scrupulously fastidious, without in the least forfeiting the respect of his fellows. It was, according to the Eton code of that time, simply a matter of personal taste. Some things you must not be. You must not be personally dirty, or a coward, or a bully, or a thief, but in this other matter you could choose for yourself without being thought either a blackguard or a prude, if you made the one choice, or if you made the other. These appeals, therefore, from the pulpit, made usually with a great deal of sincere ardour, were merely looked upon as slightly absurd. The authorities had their view on the subject, of course, we knew that, and we had the other. No kind of impression, therefore, was ever made by these fervent discourses, since the preacher was nothing of a real orator, and no comment ever uttered upon them, except an observation, perhaps, that A something seemed very excited to-day. In a word, such warmth of feeling upon a subject on which our minds were completely made up, one way or the other, seemed to us to be slightly bad form. In any case, too, it was not a subject for public discussion. It was the lack of individual dealing with the soul, then, that was accountable for so much evil. Efforts have been recently made, I believe, to remedy this in some degree. And yet the true and only remedy is, as a matter of fact, practically impossible. until something resembling the business-like system of Catholic schools in the encouragement of private devotion, the regularity of confession, or at least the recognition of some such practice as a reasonable mode of relief, until these things in some form or another find their places in the great Protestant public schools, I do not understand how the public formalities of religion can be anything more than formalities, and yet nothing but the peculiar safeguards of the Catholic confessional can really meet the case, and these, from the very nature of the case, are out of the question. A purely voluntary system of confession, such as that practised at the Woodward schools, though better than nothing, yet has unavoidable drawbacks. It was after leaving Eton, and before going up to Cambridge, that I received what was really the first touch of personal religion. I was in London for a year or so, and for a short time I was vaguely interested in theosophy. Then suddenly I became entirely absorbed and fascinated by the music and dignity of worship in St. Paul's Cathedral. The high celebration there is, indeed, as Gounod is supposed to have said, one of the most impressive religious functions in Europe. I began to go to communion every week, and to attend every other service that I could possibly manage, sometimes in the organ loft, watching the mysteries of the keys, and sometimes sitting in the stalls. I did not in the least appreciate the sermons, though I was vaguely affected by Canon Leedon. It was the music first and last, and it was through that opening that I first began to catch glimpses of the spiritual world, and my sense of worship was further developed and directed by an absolute passion that I conceived for Mr. Shorthouse's book, John Inglesant. I read it again and again, as I read it still, though aware of its tendency to pantheism, and even now I know passages of it by heart, particularly those dealing with the person of our Lord. It seemed that I had found at last the secret of those vague religious ceremonies to which I had always conformed with uninterested equanimity. A very warm friendship or two, also formed at this time, helped me in the same direction. At Cambridge everything receded once more, with the exception of a sudden short and intense interest in Swedenborgianism. Then I lost all interest. I neglected my prayers, except for a while when my father gave me a beautiful edition of Bishop Andrew's Preces Privitae in Greek and Latin. I also gave up communion, and the sole thread that was left to attach me in any sense to the supernatural was, once more, music. I very seldom attended my own chapel, but went instead continually to the evening service at King's, which, in another way from that of St. Paul's Cathedral, was and is quite incomparable. About half a dozen times, too, I attended, with a recent convert, also an old Etonian, High Mass at the Catholic Church, where I worked later as a priest. But it made no impression on me, except one of vaguely mingled contempt and awe. But I remember distinctly an agreeable sense of shock and elation when at the asperges one day I felt a drop of holy water on my face. My friend lent to me a Garden of the Soul, which I never returned to him. 12 years later, when I was myself a Catholic, I wrote to remind him of this, observing now that the book was more mine than ever. Of course, what religion I had was very little more than artistic. It made no sort of difference to my actions, but it kept me just in touch with things that were not wholly of this world. My relations with regard to religion were very aptly illustrated by a little adventure I passed through in Switzerland about this time. One of my brothers and I were ascending the Pispalou, a peak of the Bernina range in the Engadine, and upon reaching the summit, after a very laborious climb, from a little after midnight until 8 o'clock in the morning, through very heavy snow, my heart suddenly collapsed. I was dosed with neat brandy, but owing to a very severe training recently undergone at Cambridge to reduce my steering weight, this failed properly to restore me, and for about 2 hours I was carried along the arête of the mountain, apparently unconscious. My brother, indeed, for the greater part of that time, thought me actually dead. Now, although I appeared unconscious, and for a while was so, I was perfectly aware, even when my senses failed to act, that I was dying. I even began to speculate what would be the first phenomenon of the supernatural world that would disclose itself to me, and I fancied, owing no doubt to the suggestion conveyed to me by the vast icy peaks on which I had closed my eyes, that this would be a vision of the great white throne. Yet never for one instant was I conscious of the least touch of apprehensiveness at the thought of meeting God, nor of the least impulse to make an act of contrition for my past life. My religion, such as it was of so impersonal and unvital a nature that, while I never doubted the objective truth of what I had been taught, I neither feared God nor loved Him. I felt no sense of responsibility towards Him, nor was I even moved at the prospect of seeing Him. I acquiesced passively in my belief that He was present, but neither shrank from Him in fear nor aspired towards Him with affection. And this, I think, was typical of my whole attitude toward religion in the ordinary life. Intellectually I accepted the Christian creed, scarcely at all with my will or my emotion. Except in moments or for short periods of superficial excitement, I was wholly uninterested. My religion had no spark in it of real vitality. In fact, my closest friend at this time was an explicitly dogmatic atheist, I think the only one I have met, and I was conscious of no particularly alarming gulf between us. One other friend of mine was also a Catholic, and with him I used to argue sometimes, but I do not think it ever occurred to me as even conceivable that his tenets could be anything but obviously absurd, though I remember being extremely annoyed one day when my atheist friend, being appealed to as an arbitrator, declared that, granted Christianity, Catholicism was its only possible interpretation. For the most part, however, I was really indifferent, spending a good deal of time in hypnotism, in which I was tolerably proficient. No person in authority ever, so far as I can remember, made the slightest effort to approach me on matters of religion. And then, even to this day, I do not know why, I decided to become a clergyman. I think the death of one of my sisters about this time helped me to the decision. But for the rest, I suspected that my motives rose largely from the fact that a clerical life seemed to me to offer the line of least resistance. I am sure that I was not calculating enough to argue to myself that being my father's son would bring me emoluments or promotion, for, honestly, these were no temptation to me at all. But I think that on the natural side, at any rate, a life spent in an ecclesiastical household, and the absence of any other particular interest, seemed to indicate the following of my father's profession as, on a whole, the simplest solution of the problems of my future. I knew, too, that my decision would give him extraordinary pleasure, and I valued his approval very highly indeed. But I think I was fairly conscientious about it all. I still had, from time to time, romantic experiences in spiritual matters, and loved spasmodically and sentimentally, or I thought I loved, the person of our divine Lord, as suggested to me by John Inglesant, and I intended, sincerely enough, to embrace the clerical life with my heart and will, and to live it as little unworthily as possible. These intentions, too, were, as I have said, clinched and brought to a point by the very keen emotions I experienced at the death of my sister, and by a little message she sent to me from her deathbed. Things were changed a little then. I began to read theology and become interested in it, especially in dogma, such as it was, and church history. But it did not even enter my head for an instant that there was anything but the Church of England to represent Christ's original institution. I did not in the least hold, as I tried to hold later, that the Anglican communion was the Catholic Church in England, and the Roman communion the Church of the Continent. In fact, I remember once in Switzerland remonstrating with the high church lady who held such views and acted upon them by hearing Mass in a Catholic chapel. The Roman Catholics, I thought, were obviously corrupt and decayed, the ritualists were tainted, and the extreme Protestants were noisy, extravagant, and vulgar. Plainly, there was only one religious life possible, that of a quiet country clergyman with a beautiful garden, an exquisite choir, and a sober bachelor existence. Marriage seemed to me then, as always, quite inconceivable. I read for orders for a year and a half with Dean Vaughan at Llandaff. He was a very unique and exceptional man, and it was owing no doubt to his extraordinary charm of personality and his high spirituality that my father, in spite of the divergence of his views from those of the Dean, decided to place me under his charge. I think that he was in some respects the most remarkable preacher I have ever heard. He wrote out his sermons with infinite pains, word for word, destroying, I believe, the entire manuscript and beginning it all over again if he were interrupted during his composition of it, and then delivering it word for word from his paper with scarcely a gesture except quick slight glances and almost timid movements of his head. But the English was simply perfect, comparable only, I think, to that of Ruskin and Newman. His voice was as smooth and pointed and pliable as the blade of a rapier, and above all he possessed that magnetic kind of personality that affected his educated hearers, at any rate, like a strain of music. He was a pronounced evangelical in his views. I still possess somewhere a couple of sets of notes that I wrote for him, under his influence, on the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper, in which anything approaching to sacramental doctrine is explicitly denied. Yet his faith was so radiantly strong, his love of the person of our Lord so intense, that his pupils, I think, whatever their predispositions, were almost unconscious of the lack of other things. When we were under his spell, it appeared as if no more could be necessary than the love and devotion of our Master to God. His wife, too, a sister of Dean Stanley, was another great feature in our life. She was a strange old lady, resembling in face Queen Victoria, and one of the cleverest women I have ever met. She talked and wrote letters brilliantly and wittily, and it was a real delight to be in her company. When 3 or 4 of us were bidden to dinner at the deanery, we used to compare our notes of invitation in order to triumph in her variety of expression. Each note was quite different from all the rest, yet each was vivid. I remember the Dean's gentle pleasure when he discovered that during a grave illness of his wife had, in despair of his recovery, actually engaged a house to retire to for her widowhood. He told us the facts in her presence, while she jerked her features about in humorous protest. "No, my dear," said the Dean at last, with his eyes twinkling like stars, "you see, I am not dead yet after all, and I'm afraid you won't get to your new house just yet." We led a very harmless life, reading Greek Testament with the Dean every morning, composing a sermon for him once a week, playing a great deal of football, and attending the cathedral services every day. It was one of the proudest days of my life when I was selected by a club to play half-back against Cardiff. But here, in spite of the Dean's strong evangelicalism, commended though it was by his charming and spiritual personality, I began to have a glimmer of more Catholic views, and for the first time in my life began to prefer communion before breakfast. This was partly through the influence of a particular man with whom I made great friends. John Inglesant also began again to reassert his power, and I even made a journey or two there, and there to see houses where I might set up, I imagined, an institution resembling that of Nicholas Ferrar at Little Gidding, where, however, women were to be strictly excluded. We were to lead a very recondite life, I remember, in a kind of scholarly solitude, but I do not remember that self-denial in any form was to play a part in it. Yet the intention was certainly good, for the chief object of the life, so far as I contemplated it, was to increase the union of our souls with the person of our blessed Lord. I was ordained deacon in 1894, after a very strange, solitary retreat, in which for about a week all religious sense deserted me. My retreat was made near Lincoln, where years ago I had lived as a child. I engaged a couple of rooms in the lodge of an old park about 4 or 5 miles out of the city, and arranged my day in what I thought a suitable manner, giving certain hours to prayer and meditation, to the recitation of the little hours in English, and to exercise. Of course it was an impossibly mad thing to do. I was in a state of tense excitement at the prospect of my ordination to the ministry. I knew nothing whatever about my own soul and the dangers of introspection, and still less about the science of prayer. The result was such mental agony I cannot even now remember without an ache of mind. It seemed to me after a day or two that there was no truth in religion, that Jesus Christ was not God, that the whole of life was an empty sham, and that I was, if not the chiefest of sinners, at any rate the most monumental of fools. I still remember the torment of Advent Sunday. I walked in the dark of the morning, fasting, into Lincoln, went to communion in the cathedral, and attended the services later in the day, sitting in the dusky nave like a soul in hell. I still cannot read the magnificent collect of Advent Sunday as appointed in the Book of Common Prayer, the rolling phrases about the works of darkness and the armour of light, or the tramping hymn, "Lo, he comes with clouds descending," without an echo of the horror coming back to me. It was on this day that for the first time I set eyes on Bishop King, even then a bent old man with a wonderfully spiritual face, walking swiftly and swayingly at the end of the procession. The bishop who had recently been tried in my father's court at Lambeth on charges of ritualism. Matters got a little better with me towards the end of my retreat. A kind of dull luminousness of faith came back, and at last I went back to Addington for my ordination to the diaconate, though still shaken and, so to speak, still spiritually hysterical. The ordination itself distracted and helped me. It was held by my father in Croydon Parish Church. I was selected as Gospeller, and Canon Mason, the late master of Pembroke College, Cambridge, preached an exceedingly fine and enkindling sermon. I remember one extremely subtle and witty sentence of it. He was speaking of the doctrinal divisions in the Church of England, and, seeking to reassure us on the point, combined geographical and dogmatic dissension together with a fine alliterativeness. in one sweeping phrase. For all our divisions, he said, we are yet united in objective truth. One form of words, and one only, is being uttered today in every diocese, from Carlisle to Canterbury, from Lincoln to Liverpool. On the following Christmas Day I assisted my father in the administration of communion in Addington Church, and then went at once to work in East London at the Eton Mission. And here, for the first time, High Church ideas began to take definite gradual possession of me. The occasion of it was as follows. I received an invitation, a month after my ordination, to be present at a retreat at Kemsing, near Sevenoaks, given by one of the Cowley Fathers. I went in high collars and a white tie, and was completely taken by storm. For the first time Christian doctrine, as Father Maturin preached it, displayed itself to me as an orderly scheme. I saw now how things fitted on one to the other, how the sacraments followed inevitably from the Incarnation, how body and spirit were alike met in the mercy of God. The preacher was extraordinarily eloquent and deep. He preached hour after hour. He caught up my fragments of thought, my glimpses of spiritual experience, my gropings in the twilight, and showed me the whole glowing and transfigured in an immense scheme whose existence I had not suspected. He touched my heart also profoundly, as well as my head, revealing to me the springs and motives of my own nature in a completely new manner. Especially he preached confession, showing its place in the divine economy. But this, very naturally, I strenuously resisted. It was not a strict retreat, and I talked freely in the afternoon with two friends, endeavouring to persuade myself that confession was no more than an occasional medicine for those who felt they needed it. But the work was done, though I did not know it until a year later. This, however, I took away, explicit from the retreat, a desire to make my own that religion which I had heard preached. But there were certain difficulties before me. The parish to which my father was sending me was not run on at all extreme lines. Confession was distinctly discouraged, and the communion was celebrated on Sundays and Thursdays only. It was an extremely beautiful church, built by Bodley on High Church lines, with Latin inscriptions quite incomprehensible to the congregation. The previous vicar, who had now become Bishop of Zululand and was a distinct High Churchman, had been recently succeeded by a chaplain of my father's, the Reverend St. Clare Donaldson, now Archbishop of Brisbane, whose views were much more evangelical. Mr. Donaldson was a magnificent worker. Great men's clubs were in full swing, and activities of every kind, bands of hope, temperance meetings, a ladies' settlement, children's plays, and above all, systematic house-to-house visiting, occupied our time. But the original High Church methods of Bishop Carter had been largely modified. The daily celebration had been abolished, and the Anglican sisters, who had previously worked in the parish, had thereupon withdrawn. I believe that the vicar did occasionally hear confessions in the vestry for 2 or 3 adherents of the old system, but he certainly neither preached nor encouraged the practice in any way. In spite of his influence, however, the ideas sown in my mind by Father Maturin began to sprout. It seemed to me then, and it seems to me still, even looking at it from the Anglican point of view, as if the only hope of really touching and holding the lives of those who live under the stress of East London sordidness and pressure lies in what may be called the materialization of religion. I mean the supplying of acts and images on which religious emotion may concentrate itself. Extreme definiteness seems necessary, and that not only in the bright and impressive adjuncts of worship, but in the modes in which individual approach to God is made. Men's clubs where religious and political conversation is against the rules, as was the case in ours, furious visiting, children's pantomimes, and general activity and fervour certainly have their place and function. But unless the individual understands where and how he may discharge his penitence or adoration, not merely as a member of a congregation, but as an unique soul, which God has made and redeemed, piety can never be more than vague and diffusive. I dimly felt this even then, and since a man's soul is nearer to himself than any other can be, I began to see that I must begin with myself. The end of it was that just before my ordination as priest, I made, with my father's consent for the first time, a full confession of my whole life before a clergyman. He was extraordinarily kind and skilful, though he gave me a penance which would occupy me half an hour every day until I came to him again 3 months later. And the joy that followed that confession was simply indescribable. I went home in a kind of ecstasy. My ordination also was an immense happiness, though I see now that there was a considerable feverishness in my emotions. I went into the Addington woods alone, telling myself that I was now a priest, that I could do for others what had been recently done for me, and I went back to East London full of enthusiasm. About this time, too, I began to take up again my acquaintance with the Cambridge friend with whom I had had many arguments, now an Oratorian novice, and I went to see him several times. But I do not think it ever seriously entered my head that his intellectual position could possibly be anything but ridiculous. Still, he was a charming man, and I have no doubt did much to break down the wall of misunderstanding that separated my mind from his. I was perfectly confident, perfectly content, and perfectly obstinate. So fearless was I of his influence that I even went to stay with him on the coast of Cornwall, and while there, having no cassock of my own, borrowed, and in a sort of joyful excitement, wore his religious habit in the pulpit of the little parish church. In October 1896, my father suddenly died on his knees in church during a visit to Mr. Gladstone at Harrowden. I was superintending the Sunday school at the Eton Mission when a telegram was put into my hands announcing the fact. On my way up to Harrowden that night, I recited as usual the evening prayer appointed for the day, and in the second lesson read the words, "Lord, suffer me first to go and bury my father, and then I will follow thee." The days that followed were full of dignity and sorrow. It seemed incredible that my father was dead. He had just returned from Ireland, where he had paid a kind of semi-official visit to the Irish Protestant Church. He had seemed full of vitality. His last written words, found on his dressing-room table, were a draft of the letter to the Times on the subject of the Pope's bull just issued condemning Anglican orders as null and void. I celebrated the communion service in Harrowden Church before we left with the coffin for Canterbury, and gave communion to Mr. Gladstone. My father's body lay in its coffin before the altar, covered with the same pall which afterwards, I believe, lay on the coffin of Mr. Gladstone himself. The funeral was wonderfully impressive. A great storm of wind, rain, and thunder raged outside, while we laid within the cathedral, near the west doors, the body of the first Archbishop to be buried there since the Reformation. It still seemed incredible, as we went home, that we should not find that same vital and eager personality to greet us as we came back to Addington. A week later my health suddenly and completely broke down, and I was ordered to Egypt for the winter at a week's notice. My last request to my vicar, I remember, before hearing this news, had been to the effect that we might have a daily celebration in future in the church in place of the 2 weekly ones that had been in use previously. But it was thought better not.
Chapter 2. Up to the time of my father's death, I do not think that a doubt had ever crossed my mind as to the claims of Catholicism. Once, I remember, in Birdcage Walk, as my father and I were riding back to Lambeth, I said to him suddenly that I did not really understand the phrase of the Creed, "I believe in the Holy Catholic Church." For instance, I said, are the Roman Catholics a part of the Church of Christ? My father was silent for a moment. Then he said that God only knew for certain who were or were not within the Church. It might be, perhaps, that the Roman Catholics had so far erred in their doctrinal beliefs as to have forfeited their place in the body of Christ. I suppose I was satisfied with his answer, for I do not remember having considered the subject any further at the time. But within 6 weeks of my father's death, matters began to appear to me in a new light, and it was during the 5 months that I spent in the East that for the first time the claims of the Catholic Church showed themselves to me. It came about in this way. First, I believe my contentment with the Church of England suffered a certain shock by my perceiving what a very small and unimportant affair the Anglican communion really was. There we were, traveling through France and Italy, down to Venice, seeing in passing church after church, whose worshippers knew nothing of us or of our claims. I had often been abroad before, but never since I had formally identified myself with the official side of the Church of England. Now I looked at things through more professional eyes, and behold, we were nowhere. Here was this vast continent apparently ignorant of our existence. I believed myself to be a priest, yet I could not say so to strangers without qualifying clauses. We arrived at Luxor at last, and found the usual hotel chaplain in possession, and I occasionally assisted him in the services. But it was all terribly isolated and provincial. Besides, he happened to be a strong evangelical, and I had very little sense of having much in common with him. He would not have dreamed of describing himself as a priest. He was ultimately killed, by the way, with his whole family, in the earthquake at Messina, where he was acting as English chaplain. This growing discomfort was brought to a point one day when I was riding in the village by myself, and went purely by caprice into the little Catholic church there. It stood among the mud houses. There was no atmosphere of any European protection about it, and it had a singularly uninviting interior. There was in it a quantity of muslin and crimped paper and spangles, but I believe now that it was in there that for the first time anything resembling explicit Catholic faith stirred itself within me. The church was so obviously a part of the village life. It was on a level with the Arab houses. It was open. It was exactly like every other Catholic church, apart from its artistic shortcomings. It was not in the least an appendage to European life, carried about like an India rubber bath for the sake of personal comfort and the sense of familiarity. Even if it did not possess one convert, it was at least looking in the right direction. I cannot say that I explicitly recognized all this at the time, but I am aware that here for the first time it occurred to me as seriously conceivable that Rome was right and we wrong. And my contempt for the Catholic Church began to take upon it a tinge of respectful fear. For my reassurance, I made great friends with the Coptic priest, and even, after my return to England, sent him a pair of brass candlesticks for his altar. I began also to reason with myself a little, and to fortify myself deliberately in my Anglican position. While I was in Cairo, I had had 2 audiences of the schismatic Coptic patriarch, and I now wrote to him, asking that I might be admitted to communion in the Coptic churches, desiring in some way to assure myself that we were not so much isolated as appeared. I did not care in the slightest whether the Copts were tainted by heresy or not, for there was a proverb about glass houses, but I did care that we Anglicans seemed so lonely and provincial. I began, in other words, for the first time to be aware of an instinct for Catholic communion. A national church seemed a poor affair abroad. The patriarch did not answer, and I was left shivering. As I came back alone through Jerusalem and the Holy Land, my discomfort increased. Here again, in the birthplace of Christendom, we were less than nothing. It is true that the Anglican bishop was extremely kind, asking me to preach in his chapel, gave me a tiny gold cross, now hanging on an image of Our Lady, and obtained permission for me to celebrate the communion in the chapel of Abraham. Yet even this was not particularly reassuring. We were not allowed to use the Greek altar. A table was wheeled in, with the vestments provided by the Anglican Confraternity of the Blessed Sacrament, and there, distracted and unhappy, watched from the doorway by politely curious Greeks, I celebrated what I believed to be the divine mysteries, weighed down by a sense of loneliness. In all the churches it was the same. Every Eastern heretical and schismatic sect imaginable took its turn at the altar of the Holy Sepulchre, for each had at least the respectability of some centuries behind it, some sort of historical continuity. I saw strange, uncouth rites in Bethlehem, but the Anglican Church, which I had been accustomed to think of as the sound core of a rotten tree, this had no privileges anywhere. It was as if it did not exist, or rather, it was recognized and treated by the rest of Christendom purely as a Protestant sect of recent origin. In a kind of self-assertion, I began to wear my cassock publicly in the streets, to the consternation of some Irish Protestants whose acquaintance I had made, and with whom, by the way, I was distressed to think that I was in full communion. I even had a kind of disputation with a shopkeeper, who said, in spite of my cassock, that he supposed I was not a priest but a clergyman. There were other clergymen in the party with whom I went up to Damascus, and 2 or 3 of us every morning before starting celebrated the communion service in one of their tents. One of them, an American, a very devout and earnest man, not only set his office publicly on horseback, but had actually brought with him vestments, vessels, candlesticks, and wafers. These I used with a secret joy. I am happy to add that he, too, has been received into the Catholic Church and ordained to the priesthood. At Damascus, I received one more blow. I read in the Guardian that the preacher to whom I owed all my knowledge of distinctively Catholic doctrine, who had been the means of bringing me to my first confession, had made his submission to Rome. It is impossible to describe the horror and the shock that this was to me. I wrote to him from Damascus, seeing, even at the moment, a kind of half-superstitious omen in the thought of what other conversion was associated with that place. A letter which I am happy to think now contained not a word of bitterness, but I received no answer. He has told me since that the unreproachful tone of the letter astonished him. It was here, too, that once more my scheme for a religious house revived, and in a kind of defiance of the feelings that were beginning to trouble me, I arranged with a friend that its constitution and ceremonial were to be distinctively English, by which I mean Caroline. We were to wear no Eucharistic vestments, but full surplices and black scarfs, and were to do nothing in particular. In this kind of mood I came back to England as to a haven of peace. There, I knew very well, I should not be troubled daily and hourly by evidences of my isolation, and I should find, moreover, exactly the atmosphere of peace and beauty for which I longed. I had been appointed assistant curate at Kemsing, the village where I had been initiated for the first time into the idea of orderly dogma, for it was necessary for me still to have but light work, owing to the state of my health. It was an extraordinarily happy life there for about a year. The old church had been restored with exquisite taste, the music was really beautiful, the ceremonial dignified and Catholic. The vicarage where I lived with my friend was a charming house and always full of charming people, and in this entirely congenial atmosphere my troubles disappeared. It was here that, for the first time, after a second retreat preached by Father Maturin, my vicar regularly introduced linen vestments in which we celebrated the early communion service every Sunday. We did not, however, use these or the lights and wafer bread at the midday celebrations, out of consideration to the very low church views of the squire, who, though himself a most charming and courteous old man, was something very like a fanatic on the side of ultra-Protestantism. I often admired his extraordinary restraint as he entertained my vicar and myself in his beautiful old house, men whom he believed in his heart to be enemies of the cross of Christ and unconscious cooperators with the Scarlet Woman of Rome. I did not much like this plan of presenting one form of worship on one occasion and another on another, for I grew daily in high church principles, and was congratulated by the clergymen in London, to whom I went regularly to confession about 4 times in the year, on my instincts for Catholicism. I think it was at this period, too, that I joined 3 ritualistic societies: the English Church Union, the Confraternity of the Blessed Sacrament, and the Guild of All Souls. Meanwhile, I was very happy at Kemsing. It was quite possible, so long as one resolutely focused one's eyes to the proper objects, to believe that the Church of England was what she claimed to be, the spiritual mother of the English and a member of the Bride of Christ. I made several friends whom, I am thankful to say, I retain to this day. I began to take pains with preaching. I did a good deal of work with children. The only reminders that ever came to me of external facts were occasional clerical meetings at which one was reminded that all the world was not as Kemsing, and occasionally and piercing little paragraphs in the newspapers to the effect that this man or that had been received into the Roman Catholic Church. It was not for about a year, however, that troubles reappeared, and I cannot remember what it was exactly which caused them. I used to have uncomfortable moments now and then, particularly after singing the choral celebration, when I wondered whether, after all, it was possible that I was wrong, and that the ceremony in which I had taken part, rendered so beautifully by art and devotion, was no more than a subjective effort to assert our claim to what we did not possess. There was a brass in the chancel to the memory of one Thomas de Hoppy, a pre-Reformation priest, and I used to ask myself sometimes what, honestly, Sir Thomas would think of it all. But all thoughts such as these I treated as temptations. I confessed them as sins. I read books on the Anglican side. I did my utmost in 1 or 2 cases to retain waivers. I thought to establish myself by contemptuous language against the Italian mission, a phrase I believe originally coined by my father. I remember especially one instance which shows how much these thoughts were in my mind at this time. I was present on the west front of St. Paul's Cathedral on the occasion of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, but I think I was as much interested in the papal representative as in anyone else. I watched him eagerly and tried to make myself believe that he was impressed by the spectacle of the Church of England in her full glory. It was really an inspiring sight, and I looked down with great enthusiasm at the archbishops and bishops assembled on the steps in positive copes. A rumor that they very nearly had consented to wear mitres as well caused great excitement in church-time circles, and at least it was pleasant to see their shining headgear of various descriptions. The Bishop of London, I remember, wore a superb gold skull-cap which was very nearly as good as a mitre, and I exulted to think of the tales the Papist would have to tell when he returned to his own arrogant friends. I was pleased also a day or 2 later on being told by a clergyman that he had actually been taken for a Roman priest in the crowd. Strangely enough, however, I was not greatly affected by the papal decision on Anglican orders that had appeared shortly before my leaving England. It had certainly been a blow, especially as I had been assured by one of the Anglican clergy who had gone to proffer information to the commission sitting in Rome that the decision would be in our favor, but I was never greatly moved by it. I was conscious of a certain bruised sensation in my soul whenever I thought of it, but never in all my Anglican days was I acutely affected either way by the condemnation. It was during this time that I received my first confession, that of an Eton boy who was staying near and who became a Catholic a few months later. I remember my alarm at the thought of being disturbed during the ceremony, for although confession was occasionally preached in the place, it was very seldom practiced. So I locked the church door, trembling with excitement, heard the confession, and then went back to the house with a sense of awful and splendid guilt. I began at last to be really restless, But even this restlessness, I perceived at the time, lay rather in the intuitive than the intellectual region. Though I read controversial books and comforted myself with Dr. Littledale's collection of sneers, I knew that this did not really touch the seat of my trouble. It lay deeper than that. It arose, I think, chiefly from two things. First, the sense of Anglican isolation that had been forced upon my notice abroad, and secondly, from the strong case for Roman continuity with the pre-Reformation Church and the respective weakness of our own. I was reminded again of these things during a month in which I acted as Anglican chaplain at Cadenabia. There was one other circumstance, besides those I have mentioned, which tended to increase my restlessness. A few miles away from us was a convent of Anglican nuns, whose outward practice was simply indistinguishable from that of a Catholic nunnery. On feasts unprovided for in the prayer book, such as Corpus Christi and the Assumption, it became the habit of certain clergy, both from London and in the country round, to attend the sacred festivities at this convent, and on half a dozen occasions I also took part. The Roman Missal was used with all its ceremonies, and on the feast of Corpus Christi a procession was formed according to the precise directions of Baldeschi in every detail. An altar of repose was set up in the beautiful garden, and the Pange Lingua sung. Now these nuns were not playing at the religious life. They recited the night office at night, according to the strictest observance, using of course the monastic breviary, and lived a life of prayer in complete seclusion. But it was impossible to persuade myself, though of course I attempted to do so, that the atmosphere bore any resemblance at all to that of the Church of England in general. The public was not admitted to these functions. I used to argue occasionally with the chaplain, who, as well as his successor, preceded me into the Catholic Church, criticizing certain details, but his answers, given with considerable learning, to the effect that since the Church of England was Catholic, she had a right to all Catholic privileges, did not satisfy me. Rather, the fact that the Catholic privileges were obviously alien to her character seemed to imply that she was not Catholic. And I am sure that these visits, almost more than anything else, began to emphasize in my mind the real gulf that separated me from Catholic Christendom. I presented a silver lamp to the statue of Our Lady in this convent — it still hangs there — in a kind of endeavor to assert my Catholic aspirations. So time went on, and my restlessness with it. I began to diagnose my own case. I told myself that the life was too happy to be wholesome, and I set about future plans. I had learned by this time a certain effectiveness in preaching. I took part in a parochial mission, and at last was invited by the canon missioner of the diocese to join him definitely in mission work. But I had begun to have thoughts of the religious life, and was further dismayed to learn that, in the chapel of the house in Canterbury which we proposed to take, there must be no such ceremonial as that to which I had become accustomed. Honestly, I do not think that I was a mere ritualist, but it seemed to me evident that faith and its expression should go together, and that it would be an undue strain to preach a religion whose obvious and inseparable adjuncts were wanting. However, I decided to accept the invitation and went to see Archbishop Temple on the subject. He was quite kind, and after half an hour's conversation, quite peremptory. I was declared to be too young for such work, and I went back to Kemsing, resolved to offer myself to the community of the resurrection, of whose fame I had heard again and again. Within a few weeks I had an interview with Dr. Gore, now Bishop of Oxford, in his canon's house at Westminster, and was definitely accepted as a probationer. Dr. Gore was extremely kind and sympathetic. He seemed to understand my aspirations, and I was deeply impressed both by his own bearing and by the quiet religious atmosphere of the house. It seemed to me now that all my troubles were at an end. I was intensely excited and pleased at the thought of the new life that was opening before me, and it became easier than ever to treat all Roman difficulties as diabolical temptations. I see now that my attention was distracted and my imagination filled with other visions. I was not really settled, but when I went up to Birkenhead for the annual retreat of the community with which my probation was to begin, I can sincerely say that no thought of henceforth ever leaving the Anglican communion appeared conceivable. I was to be launched in a new sea altogether. I was to live as the friars had lived 500 years ago. I was to realize, though in an unexpected fashion, my old dreams of Llandaff and Damascus. I was to dedicate myself to God once and for all in the highest vocation open to man.